Hello everybody, welcome to another video, another session with Minions. I just finished an insane grind with them and holy smokes, they are so strong. I figured out a new build with Minions and it is crazy. The uptime on all of my abilities is wild. I mean, just look at the cooldown on this ultimate. How insane is this? Minions are extremely strong this season. They are severely underrated. Honestly, I think Minions might be Necromancer's best build without uniques. And I think even when you get full uniques, Minions are going to be competitive with Necromancer's best builds. Minions are crazy. With the current build, I've already cleared a Nightmare 93 dungeon. I've already been farming Duriel. I mean, I've pretty much done everything in the game. This build can already do Nightmare 100. And I'm telling you guys, Minions are the wave. This version of Minions is completely different than any other Minion build that's ever existed. There's been things that have been close to this before, but no build has ever been able to reach the level that this build can now get to, thanks to some key changes in Season 3, as well as some key adjustments to this build. The cornerstone of this entire build is the Unyielding Commander's aspect. This aspect gives your minions a massive attack speed buff, and very importantly, a massive damage reduction buff while Army of the Dead is active. The size of these buffs is completely crazy. I'm talking about a 100% attack speed and a 90% damage reduction buff. However, this Army of the Dead build has always had two big problems. One was uptime of Army of the Dead, and the other was that the extra attack speed from Army is generally completely useless because you were overcapping attack speed anyway. However, our legendary Paragon node, Cult Leader, has been reworked this season so our minions' damage scales off of their attack speed, meaning we're no longer punished for going over the cap, we're actually rewarded. So our minions become super powerful whenever Army of the Dead is active, but this ability has a 70-second cooldown and it's only up for 7 seconds. So how do you make this work? We're going to be using the Fast Blood aspect, which is going to reduce our ultimate cooldown by 1.5 seconds every time we pick up a Blood Orb. To spawn Blood Orbs, we're going to be running Corpse Tendrils with Blighted Corpse Tendrils, which will cause them to spawn Blood Orbs every time it deals damage to an enemy. And then we're going to be running the Sacrilege aspect, which will constantly recast our Corpse Tendrils for free. And so we're going to be spamming Corpse Tendrils, spawning tons of orbs, and the orbs are going to reduce the cooldown on Army of the Dead every time we pick them up. Now, this is all normal. This has always existed. What makes this so much better in Season 3? Well, our Bone Prison got a new rune that reduces our active cooldowns by 3 seconds for each enemy trapped by the Bone Prison. This means if we get a group of enemies, we cast Corpse Tendrils, our ring cast a Corpse Tendrils for free, then we Bone Prison the group. A, we're applying Vulnerable to the whole group, and B, we're actually reducing the cooldown on Corpse Tendrils and the Golem active and our ultimate by 3 seconds. So the Golem active is doing tons of damage, the Corpse Tendrils is being spammed and spawning globes, we're already reducing the cooldown of our ultimate, and then every time we pick up a globe, it's healing us, it's healing our minions, it's giving us Fortify, and it's reducing the cooldown on our ultimate. And this is the core engine of how the build works. We're going to be running into packs. We're going to be spamming Bone Prison. We're going to be spamming Corpse Tendrils. We're going to be spamming Blood Golem. Our raised skeletons are going to be getting spammed automatically by our ring. We're going to keep up our buffs. And we're going to spam Army of the Dead every single time it's up. And holy smokes, when this thing works, you will have, like, minions have never been tanky. That has never been a thing before. But now my minions just don't die. They just stand there forever. It doesn't matter how long the mobs live. The minions don't die. It's actually so crazy how well this build works together. For example, the Sacrilege ring is going to keep us raising skeletons, it's going to refresh our priest buff, and it's going to spawn the Corpse Tendrils. It's just doing so many things for us. And on top of that, those health globes that we're spawning, we're getting fortified, they're reducing the cooldown of our ultimate, they're healing our minions. So even outside of Army of the Dead, we're constantly healing our minions with health globes, keeping them healthy. And so all of this combined just makes this build so strong. And with all that being said, let's finally get into the skill tree and see how everything is working. So our skill tree is pretty similar, but a bit different from our old minion builds. So for our basic skill, it actually doesn't matter what you take because we're not putting a basic skill on your bar. So that's already different, so that's cool. And our core skills, we're going to be putting 3 points into Hued Flesh for the corpse generation. And then moving on, we're going to be putting 3 points into Skeletal Warrior Mastery, 5 points into Bone Prison. The reason we're doing this is because we want the cooldown as low as possible. The more we can Bone Prison, the better. Because remember, every time we can Bone Prison, it's half a second per enemy inside the prison, up to 6 enemies, so 3 total seconds. And it does actually reduce the cooldown of the Bone Prison itself. So we get the cooldown all the way down to 13.62 by getting it to rank 5 out of 5. And then when we cast it, the cooldown goes down to 10 seconds. And then a bunch of other things are going to reduce the cooldown even more. And then when we Bone Prison, it's going to reduce the cooldown of everything else. Anyway, getting ahead of myself. This build is just so fun. I love this build. We're going to be putting 1 point into Spiked Armor. This is going to give our minions Thorns so that they can proc Lucky Hit. Whenever minions' Thorns get hit, they actually proc Lucky Hit, which is kind of odd. We're going to be putting 1 point into Grim Harvest to get access to Field by Death, which we're doing 3 points. This is going to get procced every time we use Ray Skeleton, and so this is going to be 100% uptime, easily. We're going to be putting 3 points into Death's Embrace. This is going to give us some much-needed survivability, and it's also going to give our minions a little bit of damage, especially our melee minions. We're going to be putting 3 points into Amplified Damage for the 12% damage buff, and 3 points into Skeletal Mage Mastery for a massive buff for our mages. Now, we're going to be running the old, tried and tested Decrepify, Enhanced Decrepify, Abhorrent Decrepify. So, if you've never played Necro before, or this is your first time watching a video, Abhorrent Decrepify is absolutely crazy, and it's going to give us a 15% chance on hit to reduce all of our cooldowns by 1 second. And this is going to include our Minions' Thorns, it's going to include Corpse Tendrils, it's going to include our Ultimate, it's going to include so many things. And you can see in these clips how much the cooldown is being reduced, in part due to Abhorrent Decrepify. And so this is just feeding into this whole engine of just reducing everything's cooldown as much as possible. We're going to be putting 1 point into Corpse Tendrils. This is because we can get so many ranks of Corpse Tendrils from other sources that we don't need to put a lot of points into it. Remember, Corpse Tendrils and Bone Prison have massive diminishing returns on their cooldown reduction after rank 5. So there's not a lot of value in going above rank 5, but there's a small amount. And like I said earlier, we're going to be taking Blighted Corpse Tendrils to spawn the Blood Orbs. And remember, the Blood Orbs are super important. You need to be picking these up as much as you can. We're going to be putting 3 points into Necrotic Carapace. This is going to be our primary Fortify generation, and this is especially good with our Army of the Dead, because the Army of the Dead is going to spawn a ludicrous amount of corpses, and each of those corpses is going to fortify us for 6%. So, very important. And it's also important to note that our Reapers are going to spawn corpses that will also give us Fortify. So, we're going to put 3 points into Golem Mastery for the 75% damage multiplier. Now, what's interesting is that in this build, actually the Golem ends up being the bulk of our damage. We'll get into exactly why as we go through this, but it's kind of useful to know the Golem, and especially the Golem active, represents a huge portion of our damage. We're going to be putting Army of the Dead. We're going to get the Prime Army of the Dead, and if you don't know, this is going to cause corpses to spawn whenever one of the skeletons from the army explodes. So this is going to basically give us all the corpses that we need to sustain our army between Army of the Dead. So, you know, we're going to Army of the Dead, our minions are going to be unkillable, they're going to do a ton of damage, and then the army's going to end, and especially our skeleton warriors are going to start dying, and that's when we use all these corpses that we're making to make new ones, and we just keep the army going, right? We keep our comp strong. What you never want to have happen is you never want the Skeletal Priest buff to fall off, which happens whenever you don't have enough corpses and your minions are dying too fast, and so you can't get this Priest buff out. That is the worst thing that can happen. So this actually helps a lot with avoiding that situation. We're also going to be running Supreme Army of the Dead, which will cause our Army of the Dead to raise our Skeletal Mages and Warriors. This is pretty useful, actually. There's a lot of situations you get into where you actually, you know, your skeletons are dead, or you cast it and you have like 4 guys dead and it quickly resummons them all. This ends up being a pretty useful utility option. I think technically you could cut it, especially for speed farming. I don't think you necessarily need it, but I like to run it. I think it makes the build a little bit smoother. We're going to be putting 3 points into Inspiring Leader for the 12% attack speed buff, and like I mentioned before, the Cult Leader node is going to buff this up, so this attack speed is really important. We're going to be putting 3 points into Hellbent Commander for a 30% damage multiplier on our minions, 3 points into Death's Defense for the armor and resistances, and then 3 points into Bonded in Essence. So Bonded in Essence is going to heal our minions for 60% of their life every 8 seconds. They're going to get a huge burst of 60% healing. And as long as your priest is up, remember, our minions are now healing for 40% over 8 seconds. And then at the end of the 8 seconds, they get healed for 60% instantly. So over the course of 8 seconds, your minions are healing for their entire health bar. And then you combine this with the health globes that we're picking up, and you can start to see how we are just pumping life into our minions. And remember, minions have a passive now that prevent them from taking more of a third of their health and damage from any one source. So when our minions get hit, they can't take more than a third of their health. And with all this health we're pumping into them, it is very hard for our minions to die. Finally, for our key passive, we're taking Callan's Edict. This is a 30% attack speed buff, which, again, before this kind of sucked. Now, it's not so bad because it pairs with Cult Leader. And so, even though we're over-capping attack speed technically, all of these things work together in order to create a very powerful build. Okay, let's briefly talk about the Book of the Dead. So, this is going to look extremely familiar if you've played Minions before. We're going to be running Reapers with the chance to spawn a corpse. Reapers are the only skeletal warrior that does AoE damage, and they have the same tankiness as the other ones, so they're pretty much just the best ones. For our mages, we're going to be running Bone Mages with the reduced life cost from 15 to 10%, and they get a 40% damage buff. So if you don't know, Bone Mages already do about 50% more damage than the other mages, but they have to use their life every time they attack. With this, they're doing 50% more times an additional 40%. So they are way outclassing the other mages at this point in terms of raw DPS. And because our build has so much healing, this health penalty really doesn't matter that much. It's not a big deal at all. I rarely see my mages die. For our Golem, and remember, this is another one of the huge buffs that happen to this build. The Blood Golem's attacks now cleave in an AoE, which is awesome because we can run this perk, and well, as long as the Blood Golem is healthy, he takes less damage and deals 50% bonus damage. So he's running around, all of his attacks are cleaving, and they're buffed by 50%. So his damage is crazy. And obviously, with all this healing we have, this dude is completely invincible. There's nothing in the game that can kill our Golem. Our Golem can literally duel any boss in the entire game. So he's always healthy, he's always getting the buff. And then his active is amazing. So the active already does a ton of damage, and it heals him, of course, because why wouldn't we have more healing? But, very importantly, he does triple damage if there's only one enemy. So in single target, in the 93 I did, you can see there's a situation where I get a full ramp off with army and everything, and just pop an elite with his active, which is crazy considering my gear score and everything. And against bosses and stuff, this build just rips bosses in half because of how strong the Blood Golem is. So, let's talk aspects. So remember, these aspects can generally go in whatever slot you want. There's only a few cases where they can't. For example, the two-handed weapon needs to go there, and the necklace needs to go where it is. But let's start with the helmet. We're going to be running Skeletal Mages, the Occult Dominion, so it's going to allow us to have 2 extra Skeletal Mages. And by the way, do not look at my stat priority. I'm wearing rags that I got while leveling, okay? I'm telling you, my gear sucks. So do not look at my stats. But we're going to be running Occult Dominion on our helmet. On our chest, we're going to be running Blood Getters. So these are going to be 2 extra mages and 2 extra warriors. The 2 extra warriors are actually really important for the extra corpse generation, and because it's going to help dilute out the damage. Because, you know, if you think about it, each mob can only really attack one enemy. So if you have 2 extra warriors, then you have 2 extra guys soaking damage, so any one warrior is less likely to die. On our gloves, we're running the Unyielding Commanders. So I actually want to move these to the necklace, and I'll explain why in a minute. But Unyielding Commanders is actually on the necklace, and then you should run Frenzied Dead on your gloves instead. For our pants, so this is another really big piece that I haven't talked about yet, which is the Juggernaut aspect. This is a new aspect this season. It gives 4,800 armor. And keep in mind, this isn't even like a max, it's max rolled, but it's not a 925. So this is going to be closer to 5,000 armor with a perfect roll. 5,000 armor permanently, all the time, no conditions. And, you know, one of the big problems that this version of the build always had is it couldn't stack Disobedience to get to armor cap because it didn't do enough instances of damage, and because your minions didn't count for Disobedience. But now we just permanently have Disobedience for pretty much free all the time. This is amazing. This is so good. On our boots, this is also another new thing we haven't talked about yet, which is the hulking aspect. So the hulking aspect, you probably don't even know what it does because it sucks so much nobody has ever played it, but it gives your golem a chance to reduce his active cooldown whenever he hits enemies, and it also causes that to spawn a corpse. I don't know if this will necessarily make it into the final cut, But for right now, when I'm under geared, I think this is super important. Because you got to remember, his attacks are cleaving, right? So he's hitting a lot of enemies, so he's proccing this fairly often. And his active is one of our biggest sources of damage. So this actually ends up being an extremely nice utility piece. Later on, we might swap this to movement speed, but for right now with my gear, I absolutely have to run this. On our weapon, we're running the aspect of reanimation. This is just going to give us an 80% damage multiplier on our minions, as long as we keep them alive, which we pretty much always do. Especially the golem, right? The golem is always alive. I already talked about the necklace, and then the sacrilege. You want the lowest roll possible on this. So, ideally, you have 1 second raised skeleton, 1 second corpse explosion, 8 second corpse tendrils. So, that's the best for that. And then for our other ring, we're going to be running the Fast Blood Band, which is going to give us cooldown reduction on our ultimate every time we pick up a health orb. So this is like the core thing where we pick up a health orb, reduces the cooldown, all that stuff that we already talked about. So if you guys want the stat priorities, I linked the full build in the description below, and I'm always going to keep that up to date. And by the way, I'm going to have to do another video later to update you guys, because this is a brand new build, and I still have a lot more cooking to do. I want to try it with better and better gear, so stay tuned for that. But full build's in the description, but let's keep going here and talk about the rest of it. So for our gems, this build actually has no unstoppable at all. Absolutely zero. Because of this, I'm running topazes in my gear, which will give me damage reduction while crowd controlled. I found that almost every time I die is because I get CC chained, and running this makes it less likely that I die when I get CC chained. We really just fundamentally don't have room for unstoppable, so you just have to deal with getting CC'd. Luckily, our sacrilege keeps casting anyway, so everything's kind of fine. On our jewelry, you should run whatever gems will get you to cap. So it's way better to run 3 different gems than it is to run resist all. So what I do is I get 2 rolls on my helmet, frost and fire. And then over here, I do poison, lightning, and shadow. And that's all 5, right? That's how I got to cap. So very important, cap your resistances. Because you have to think, right? Juggernaut, 5,000 armor. Then you cap your resistances and suddenly not much does damage to you. Let's talk about the construct. So I'm going to be honest with you guys. I think the construct barely matters, but I'm running protect for the barrier, and the barrier ends up being pretty nice because our key passive and the 12% attack speed buff from our skill tree both require us to not really take damage. So having a barrier to mitigate that incoming damage once in a while is very nice. We're running Fortify support here for just a little bit of extra Fortify generation, and then we're running Duration support to just increase its duration. I haven't figured out anything useful to put here yet, so it's still empty for now. And then for our other one, we're going to be running Pummel. The reason for this is because it has a 1.7 second cooldown, so it's going to be getting spammed. And then we're going to be running Safeguard, so it's constantly giving us this damage reduction. This effect is actually pretty strong, and I'm going to be leveling this glyph all the way up. And this is actually going to be pretty significant, to be honest with you. It's very nice. We're going to be running Breaking support, so this is going to break barriers, which is pretty nice, so like break shields and that kind of thing. But the other thing it does, which is very interesting, is that it applies vulnerable. And this is actually a build that struggles to get vulnerable out, so it ends up being okay. And then finally, we're going to be running this, which is going to give us 6% crit against them. I don't know if this is 6% for us, so our minions get 30% of that, or if the minions get the full 6%. I haven't tested this yet, but either way, it's decent. So, like I said, construct, pretty underwhelming, but, I mean, it's nice, right? Finally, let's talk about the Paragon board. Like I said, link to the full build in the description, and keep in mind, this Paragon board is slightly different because I had to modify it to be able to do hard content while under geared, but I think in general the board in the description is better. So first of all, we're going to be running Amplify for the 10% damage buff against enemies with curses, which is all enemies, so this is just a 10% damage multiplier. Very nice. Now, we're coming up to the Cult Leader board. So Cult Leader, as we discussed, has been reworked to do 10% damage multiplier for every 20 attack speed, and very importantly, on this board, we're getting the Dead Razor glyph. This is absolutely 1000% required. You want to do your own theory crafting, change the board, go for it, but you cannot move Dead Razor. It has to be here, and that's because it's going to buff this glyph, or this node rather, which is going to give us 35% damage reduction, and then all of these, which are all 8.8, and that's only at level 15. With a max level glyph, it's so much. It's wild. Our next board is going to be Flesh Eater. So this is something I've actually started paying attention to this buff. If you don't know, it's actually tracked right above your skills, and you can track how many corpses you've consumed. And I time it so that I always have this buff during my Armies of the Dead. Now, you don't necessarily have to do this. You're naturally going to proc Flesh Eater all the time, But if you're looking for a more advanced min-maxed gameplay, then try to time your Flesh Eaters with your Army of the Deads. And then here we're going to be picking up the Golem glyph. And again, Golem again got buffed, this glyph. It used to be 25% health for the additional bonus, now it's 25% damage. So you can see we've got this Golem glyph, we have the Blood Golem. Like, the Golem is wildly strong. And then when we get up here to the Golem tree, right, where is it? Up here, which I haven't taken this yet, but I'm going to take this before the end. This has a 17% attack speed buff on it, and you get 4%, 4%. And so all of that is feeding into Cult Leader. So he's even getting all these extra multipliers that he wasn't getting before. And then we're also taking Hulking Monstrosity, which is a crazy node, by the way. 40% health and 100% damage for the Golem. So you can see this Golem is an absolute monster. He is the carry of this build. He's the main character. Deciding where you use his active is very important. Making sure you position him correctly, trying to line it up so that your Bone Prison is out and enemies are vulnerable. And remember, ideally, you want to have your Army of the Dead rolling before you activate the Blood Golem, because the Army of the Dead is going to give him a ton of attack speed, which is going to proc the Cult Leader, right? So he's going to be doing like almost double damage during Army of the Dead. So it's very important that you try to army before you use his active, and it's also important you try to apply vulnerable with the Bone Prison before you use his active. And for our glyph here, we're taking the Mage, which is going to give our mages some damage, which is actually pretty nice. These, because we don't have a lot of plus minion damage, these kind of additive values end up being a lot of damage. And on top of that, it's going to give all of our minions 35% resist, which is awesome. Okay, so this is where we get into a little customization. So my gear isn't perfect, and I wasn't able to cap my resistances. So I went a little off-grid here, and you're going to see there's going to be a difference between the build I recommend and this one, and that's because my gear wasn't good enough to hit res cap. So I modified it. And I grabbed a Blood Drinker for the Fortified Generation. So anyway, that's the Paragon board, and that's pretty much the video. I mean, I hope you guys liked it. I'm so excited to have minions. I can't believe how many people said minions were going to suck. I was reading the patch notes and I was like, is nobody else saying this? Like, minions don't suck. Minions are actually insane. But everyone kept saying they sucked. So I said, okay, so I have to play minions then. And I played them, and holy smokes, they are so good. And like I said, I'm going to keep making it better. This is just iteration 1. I'm telling you guys, this build is going to get way better than it is right now. And I'm so excited for that. And I've also got some other builds. Now, don't tell anybody I told you this. There's another Necro build. I haven't seen anybody talk about it yet. I just need to farm the unique for it, and that's going to be the next build I cover, and that's going to be something I haven't seen anyone talk about. So, anyway, I'll see you guys in the next video. Thank you guys for watching. I know this is a longer one, so I appreciate it. All right, see ya.